Thanks very much, Mike. It feels good to be standing right here because it was, what, 4 years ago, Barry, that you and I did a semester. And I don't remember what we called the class that semester other than the open classroom, but I know what the underpinning, the underlying message that we were trying to deliver was this question of what do you want government to do and how much do you want to pay for it? And it's been 4 years, and maybe we will creep up to a national answer to that question with this election. I sure as heck hope so. At the time, I remember we talked about we wanted to have the ability to have a rational and respectful discussion about that. That hasn't happened yet, at least as far as I can tell. But if it doesn't happen in the next few months, we're going to be facing some difficulties. And I know Eric is going to be covering that, but that's a concern I think we should all have. Now, this sort of tinkers to ever so chance, you know, Barry to Mike, Mike to me to Eric. So I'm just really pleased to be introducing Eric, but I want to begin with a couple of comments. You know, there are times in history when the unique characteristics of a person virtually match or determine the outcome of the situation. And I'm sure you can all think of a few things like that. I know everybody in this audience, I was so blown away 4 years ago with how smart everybody in this audience is because they ask such great questions. But if you think of U.S. history, I mean, George Washington's a perfect example. If George Washington's personal characteristics hadn't been so adverse to accepting public glory, we probably would have named him king, and things would have worked out very much differently than they did. But he refused to even talk about that. He kept going home when people, you know, when he found that there was an opportunity to go home. And we all benefited from the fact that George Washington did not want to be king and therefore set the course of the history of this country. Lincoln. Without Lincoln, we would not have had a civil war by most calculations. That might have been a good thing in terms of the fact that that was the bloodiest war relative to the size of the country we've ever had. But it certainly would have been a bad thing because there would have been two countries, North and South, clearly very different from what happened, and all because of the impact of one person on history at that moment in time. A little closer to home, a little more relevant, Paul Volcker. Comes along just as the country needs the tough medicine of high interest rates, unfortunately high unemployment, low growth went with that for a short period of time, but he did, through his courage, break the back of the 70s inflation. And if he hadn't done that, the 30 years since then, 30 years or so since then, would have been very different. Hard, you know, I can't lay it out all for you, but I don't think we would have had the period of sustained growth, productivity improvement, welfare improvements, and so forth over the last 30 years without that man being the right man for the time. Closer to now. Ben Bernanke, another case in point. This country could not, in my view, could not have been more fortunate than to have an expert in the Depression at the helm of the Fed just when we needed quick action, just when we needed commitment to both sides of the Fed's dual mission. And under the rubric of one picture being worth 1,000 words, well, so much for that picture. Let's see, John, how do we do this? Oh, one doesn't win up, one comes to the side. Okay. This is a picture of the Fed's balance sheet. This is a picture of Bernanke and the Federal Open Market Committee, including my colleague Eric, in action. What happens when the Fed's balance sheet expands? Anybody know the question? The answer to that question? What's the Fed doing when its balance sheet expands?
Creating money.
Right. And how are they doing it? They're buying securities in the open market, so they're affecting the price and the availability of those securities, which affects interest rates, and it pushes cash out to banks, and it loads up the asset side of the Fed balance sheet. Well, look at that. Look at that. Roughly 800 billion or so, roughly 2.5 trillion or so, in a very short period of time, through a wide variety of programs. Initially, programs that I think of as the alphabet soup, because they were really aimed at particular markets that were seized up, like asset-backed commercial paper, and you could go on and on. There's several of them. And then focused on what's become known as quantitative easing, then focused on different parts of the yield curve, and now, rather open-endedly, focused on getting the economy to grow again and solving the key issue of this recession/recovery period, i.e. job growth, through making people feel wealthier, feeding businesses, getting businesses to hire people, and starting that virtuous cycle of upward movement in the economy. Now, Eric's been a member of the Open Market Committee throughout this period. And without making him feel too good about this, I'm not saying he's Washington or Lincoln or Volcker or Bernanke, but he has been, I think, the right person at the right time in a few places along his career. He arrived at the Boston Fed a bit before I did. I came in 1991, as Mike said. He got there 89? 85, oh gosh, you're older than I thought. He was an academic expert in banking, and New England, in 1990, what did we have? A banking crisis. We had an expert in banking at the Boston Fed. It was this area of the country's worst banking crisis since the Depression. Eric learned a lot from that. Using those lessons, he became a sought-after expert, consulting with, among others, the Japanese, who in the 90s and even now are having their own little homegrown banking problem. Over the ensuing years, he and I used to talk about, okay, you've done enough research, what else are you going to do? Where are you going to go? What are you going to do with the bank? And I remember sitting at the lunch table with him. He's going, I don't want to read research. I like research. I said, no, Eric, you really have to think about, growing and managing things in the bank, and I need you to be a manager. So finally I convinced him. He finally agreed in the late 90s to take the position as Senior Vice President in charge of supervision and regulation. And literally 2 months, almost to the day after that, 500 pages of the first draft of Basel II landed on my desk, and I just shipped it off there. As it turned out, the combination of being an economist and a banking supervision person really worked at that point in time, and the Boston Fed was able to make a great contribution, I think, to the evolution of the Basel process, which is the process of setting international capital standards for banks. There's been a lot of discussion about that recently. There are a lot of concerns about how it's getting done now, particularly with banking crises popping up in Europe and elsewhere. But I feel very confident that the Fed is better off from the contributions under Eric's leadership that were able to be made in Boston. In 2007, I decided, being 60 years old at the time, that I would leave. I mean, everything was fine, right? The transition from Bernanke, from Greenspan to Bernanke went well. I had 2 or 3 people in the bank, including Eric, who could be good successors. I had to leave at age 65, so why not leave at age 60 and figure out how to use the next 20 years of my life productively. So it's June 2007. I go to the last, in my view, quote-unquote normal open market committee. Eric's been my successor. I leave the Fed, and what do we have but a banking crisis? The right person at the right time. Eric Rosengren.